Hello and welcome back to another video. So I'm back today with another full step-by-step PC build guide, and I'm going to be showing you how to put all the parts I've got in front of me together today and come up with a working PC by the end of the video. So if you've never built a PC before, don't worry, you've come to the right place. I'm going to be going through everything really slowly, from putting all the parts together, installing Windows, any drivers and programs that we're going to need. I'm going to show you how to set up and control the RGB in the build, overclock your RAM, and then at the end of the video we'll run some benchmarks to give you an idea of the performance you're going to get from this PC. Okay, so let's start off by having a look at the parts I've chosen for today's build. For the case, I've gone with Cooler Master's TD500 Mesh, and 2020 really was the year for mesh fronted airflow focus cases, and this is Cooler Master's offering in this regard. The case is available in black and white. I've gone with the white version, and it comes with 3 addressable RGB fans included at the front, although there is an option to add a further 4 fans, 3 at the top and 1 at the rear, which I'm going to be doing. For the motherboard, I've gone with MSI's X570 Unify, and I suppose the defining feature of this motherboard is the absence of RGB. It's a pretty powerful motherboard, perfect for overclocking, and it will take up to 3 M.2 SSDs. For the CPU, I've been fortunate enough to get my hands on one of the new Zen 3 CPUs from AMD. I've got the Ryzen 5800X, which is an 8-core CPU, which will be very comfortable for gaming, but also perform well in content creation. Keeping the CPU cool, I've gone with a tried and trusted 360mm AIO. It's the Deepcool Castle 360EX. I think this is a great looking CPU cooler, and it always performs well in terms of both noise and thermals. So as we mentioned, this motherboard has 3 M.2 SSD slots, and they will all support Gen 4 speed, which is one of the advantages of X570. I'm not going to be taking full advantage of that because I've only got one Gen 4 SSD. It's the new Samsung 980 Pro in 1TB in size. I'm going to be filling up the other 2 M.2 SSD slots with one of Samsung's other drives. It's the 970 EVO, and I've got 2 of these both in 1TB of size. So you may not need that amount of storage, so feel free to leave any of the drives out that you're not going to need, or use drives with a lower capacity. So although we've got plenty of storage with our 3 1TB M.2 SSDs, I am going to show you how to install a SATA SSD in this build. The drive I've chosen is from Team Group. It's 250GB in size, and it's the T-Force Delta RGB. The big reason for including this drive is its looks. When the RGB is lit up, it looks absolutely brilliant. And this case has 2 spaces in the front, down at the bottom above the power supply shroud, for SATA SSDs. Now, one of those spaces is going to be taken up with the 3 power supply cables going to our graphics card, and that's the reason I'm going to include one of these SATA SSDs. The RAM I'm going to be using in today's build is also from Team Group. It's the T-Force Dark Z, and I've got 32GB in 3200MHz speed. I think you'll agree the RAM looks absolutely great, and a big thank you to Team Group for sending it out for today's build. Powering the whole build, I've got a fully modular 850W power supply from Corsair. It's the RM850. For the graphics card, I've gone with the ROG Strix RTX 3080. And this is the top of the line overclocked model, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how this performs alongside our Zen 3 CPU. Final part of the build is some black and white cable extensions from CableMod. I've used these in a number of builds before, and I think they really improve the aesthetic of the build, particularly in a white case where you're going to use a lot of black and white parts. Obviously these are optional, you no need to pick them up. The power supply will work by itself, but the build will definitely look better with these included. Okay, so that's all the parts. Let's get on with the build. So the first thing I like to do in any build is to prepare the case. By that I mean removing any panels, dust filters, or anything that's going to get in our way during the build. So let's go ahead and get the panels removed. The left side panel is held on with 2 captive thumb screws at the top, so once these are loosened, we can simply lift the panel out and away from the case. The right side panel again is held on with 2 thumb screws at the back. Once these are loosened, the panel can be simply slid to the back and lifted away. To remove the front panel, we just simply need to pull at the bottom and it should lift straight off. We've got a magnetic dust filter at the top which can simply be lifted away. Down at the back of the case, we've got 2 bags containing our case accessories, and I'll show you what this includes. Okay, so this is what's contained in those two accessory bags. So we've got two different sizes of screws. The bigger screws are for securing our motherboard to the case and also securing our power supply to the case. We've got 8 smaller screws, and these are to secure 2.5-inch drives into the hard drive cage. If we need to move our case standoffs, they include a little tool that allows you to do it. This end goes over the standoffs, and we can use a normal screwdriver then to loosen them up and move them to somewhere else in the case. To secure our SSDs either in the front or at the rear of the case, we need to use these next two items. These little rubber grommets will push into holes in the case. We're going to screw these little pegs then into the back of our SSDs, and then they're going to push into the rubber grommets holding our SSDs in place. And this is definitely one of my favourite methods for mounting SSDs in any case, and a big fan of Cooler Master using these. We've got some cable ties to help with cable management. Cooler Master also include an addressable ARGB controller, which lets us control the RGB on our front 3 case fans if our motherboard doesn't have an addressable header, or we don't want to download the motherboard's RGB software package. So you can see the 2.5-inch SSD mounting locations at the back of the case. This is our hard drive cage where we can mount also 2.5-inch drives, but also two 3.5-inch drives. I'm not going to actually mount any SSDs or hard drives in here, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the hard drive cage. So we can remove the drive trays by pulling these out at the back. And then we can actually go ahead and remove the right side of the hard drive cage. The left hand side is fixed, and the advantage for doing that is we're going to have more space for our cables at the bottom of the case. I actually quite like having this fixed because this is going to act as a little wall controlling all our cables and keeping them out of view. Another thing to point out down the bottom of the case, we've got an additional dust filter here which is going to filter the air coming into our power supply. So it's these two screws which we need to remove. And then there's another two screws at the top of the bracket in the inside of the case. We can see now with those 4 screws removed, this bracket is completely loose and can simply remove from the case, and we've significantly increased the amount of space we have for cables at the bottom of the case. This is our motherboard, and we're going to do as much work with the motherboard as we can before we put it into the case, because it's much easier working on a flat table than it is in the cramped confines of a case. So we're going to go ahead and put our CPU into this socket in the middle of the motherboard, our M.2 SSDs behind these 3 heatsinks, our RAM into here, and then we're also going to change the mounting brackets for our AIO all before we put the motherboard into the case. To prepare our motherboard to receive the CPU, all we need to do is open this little clip all the way over to the right hand side. Just before we go ahead and put our CPU into the socket, I want to point something out on the socket. You'll notice this top left hand corner has a little triangle on the socket itself, and there's a little white mark on the motherboard. And that is to highlight this corner as the corner we need to line up with a gold mark on our CPU, which I'll show you in a minute. This is our CPU, and what you'll notice is I'm holding it by the edges, and the reason for that is I don't want to damage these gold pins on the bottom of the CPU. The other thing to point out, if you look at the corner, which is now at the top of the screen, it has a little gold triangle on it, and this is the corner that we're going to have to line up with the mark on the socket. If we turn it over, you'll notice there's also a little gold mark on the corner, which is now down the bottom left hand side of the CPU. So that's the side of the CPU is going to have to line up with the mark on the socket. Okay, so I've got the CPU round in the right orientation. I'm just going to hover it over the socket and let it fall into place. I'm not going to go pushing it in because if I do that I can damage the pins. So I'm just going to move it about a little bit, and at one point it will just fall into the socket like it has done now. There's nothing else that needs to be done. All we need to do is close the little lever, and we've now installed our CPU. Next we're going to go ahead and install our M.2 SSDs, and there's 3 heat sinks over each of the M.2 SSD sockets. We're going to occupy all 3 of the sockets. It is important to check your motherboard manual on the specifications of each of the sockets. As this is an X570 motherboard, all the sockets will support Gen 4 M.2 NVMe SSDs. If you're using a B550 board, there is a few of them that will support more than one Gen 4 SSD, but most of them is only the top socket that supports Gen 4 speeds. If you're using an older motherboard, what you might actually find, the only socket that supports NVMe drives may well be the top socket, and other drives may support SATA drives. It's also important with the other boards, if you put an M.2 SSD in some of the sockets, some of your SATA ports may deactivate. or in other instances it'll reduce the speed of your graphics card. So it is really important to read your manual, find out what each of the sockets does, and then you're installing your SSDs in the right sockets and you're aware of any sacrifices you're making by occupying that socket. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get the heat sinks off. And then we should simply be able just to lift these away. So these are the M.2 SSD sockets. Our drive is going to go into the socket and then we're going to put a screw through it into these standoffs and secure it into place. So the first thing we want to do is check that the standoffs are in the right location. You can see here we've got 2 additional holes. We can move the standoff from here to one of these sockets if we need to. So lining the drive up, we can see for the top socket the standoff seems to be in the right place. For the next socket down, this is the standoff we're going to screw into. Now each of these are secured in slightly different ways. We're going to have to secure our top drive with a screw from our motherboard box, but actually the drive's down below. The heatsink screw is actually going to go into the standoff and secure the drive, but also the heatsink. The drive at the bottom, again, it's the furthest away standoff. So it's really important that we remove this middle unused standoff, because if we secure our drive with it in place, there's a risk of it putting pressure on our drive and damaging it. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove the middle standoff in the bottom sockets. And again, I'm going to put this into the motherboard box so I don't lose it. So as a general rule, you tend to want to install your fastest M.2 SSD into the top slot. Although all 3 of these support Gen 4 speeds and have the same number of PCIe lanes, the socket at the top goes straight to the CPU, while the bottom 2 go via the chipset. So we're going to put our Gen 4 drive into the top slot. So to install, all we need to do is insert it at a slight angle into the socket, and then we can go ahead and secure it into place using the screw that we're going to get in our motherboard box. Okay, we'll go ahead and put our Gen 3 drives into the sockets down below. Just before we go ahead and put our heat sinks back on, I've used this motherboard before. If you're using it for the first time, there will be some plastic protection here which you're going to need to remove before first use. This is our RAM, and what you'll notice, there's 2 gold connectors down the bottom of it. Importantly, they aren't of equal length. The one over to the right hand side is slightly longer than the one over to the left hand side, and this is going to be important when we're lining it up with the socket. Our RAM is going to go into these 4 sockets here on the motherboard. Importantly, our kit of RAM has come with 4 sticks of RAM, so we're not going to have any problems deciding which sockets to put it into. If you do only have 2 sticks of RAM, it is important that you read the motherboard manual and find out which of the sockets you need to occupy first. There's a helpful note on the motherboard here which tells you that first we need to occupy the 2nd slot along from the CPU and the 4th slot along from the CPU if we've only got 2 sticks of RAM. To prepare the motherboard to receive the RAM, we need to open the clips. A lot of motherboards will only have clips at the top. This motherboard also has clips at the bottom as well. So we'll go ahead and open them on all 4 slots. To install the RAM into the sockets, all we need to do is line the RAM up with the socket. Once we're happy it's in the right place, we just need to apply a little bit of pressure to the top of the RAM and it'll click and lock into place. Just the same process with the 2nd stick of RAM. Line things up. And then the final stick. Next, we're going to need to go ahead and remove the stock CPU cooler brackets because our AIO is going to use a different mounting system. So we just need to remove the screws. Each of the brackets is held on with 2 screws. Importantly, don't throw these away because if you want to sell your motherboard later or change your CPU cooler, you may well need these, and I'm frequently asked in the comments, where do you buy these from? They come with your motherboard, and best place to keep them is in the motherboard box, so you ever need them again, you'll know where to find them. Next thing for us to do is to screw in these mounting brackets for our AIO. There's a thick end and a thin end. It's the thick end that we want to screw into our motherboard backplate. And importantly, this is the back plate that's come with the motherboard. We haven't changed it. So all we need to do is hand tighten this. We're now ready to go ahead and put our motherboard into the case, and we're going to secure it to these standoffs at the back of the case. They're in 3 rows of 3. Importantly, the standoffs are in the right place for us because we've got an ATX motherboard. There's a little code which is just here, and if you're going to use a different size of motherboard, you can use the little tool that came in the accessory bag to move the standoffs into their correct position. I've had a check already, and the standoffs are already in the right place for our motherboard. The other important thing to point out is the middle standoff looks slightly different to the other standoffs, and that's because it's designed to pass through the hole in the middle socket of the motherboard and help hold the motherboard in place to allow you to get the other screws in. Another important thing to mention, if your motherboard doesn't have the AIO shield attached, go ahead and install it now before you insert the motherboard. Okay, so all we need to do is line the motherboard with the slot at the back of the case. And then we need just to get one of the screws in, and that'll make the rest of it a little bit easier. Now importantly, our 9th standoff, the one in the middle, is hidden behind the heatsink here. I could leave it out, but for completeness I'll remove the heatsink and secure the middle standoff. Next thing for us to do is to go ahead and plug in our case cables, which are these cables coming from the front AIO, but also the case fans. And the reason we want to do that at this stage is at the moment we've got pretty good access to all around the motherboard. Once we start putting a radiator, fans, other items into the case, access to these ports is going to get much more difficult, and that's why I like to do it at this stage. So what are the case cables? So at the top we've got 2 USB Type A ports, and we're going to need to plug this USB 3.0 cable into our motherboard to allow those ports to work. At the top we've also got a headphone and microphone jack, and we're going to need to plug our HD audio cable in to allow that to work. We've also got these tricky front panel connector cables. The reason I say they're tricky is they all go into one header, and they all go into specific pins on that header. So they are going to power our power switch, our reset switch, our power LED, and our hard drive LED. As well, in this case, Cooler Master have made it really easy for us to connect up our front fans. Each of these fans has 2 connectors coming from it. There's a 3-pin connector for power, and we've also got a 3-pin addressable ARGB cable. Now, our motherboard only has 2 addressable ARGB cables, but that's not a problem because Cooler Master include a triple splitter cable. It has 2 different connectors coming on the end of it. One is for Gigabyte motherboards, one is for Asus, ASRock and MSI. So we're going to need to plug this end into one of the addressable headers in our motherboard to allow our motherboard to control all the fans. The other cable coming from our 3 fans is Cooler Master have combined them into a triple fan splitter cable. So we've got one 3-pin connector to plug into one of our case fan headers on our motherboard, rather than needing to plug all 3 of the fans in separately. Okay, so it's important when installing the cables, we want to bring the cable through the cutout in the case, which is closest to the header we're going to plug it into. Our HD audio cable is going to go into this header down the bottom left-hand side of the motherboard. Importantly, we're going to want to install it with the HD audio text facing upwards. So we just line things up with the header and push it in. Next to this cable, we've got a 3-pin 5-volt addressable ARGB header on the motherboard, and this is where we're going to plug the triple splitter cable coming from our 3 fans at the front of the case. We do have another option, and that is to use the controller that came with the case. Because I've got other things that are going to need ARGB, I'm going to use our motherboard to control them. So I'm going to go ahead and plug the cable into here. So I'm just going to bring it through the cutout. Now, importantly, if we look at this cable, there's 2 pins, there's a space, and then there's another pin. And our header is exactly the same way, so it's important we line things up the right way round. The other important thing to mention is this is a 5-volt 3-pin addressable RGB header. Our motherboard also has a 4-pin 12-volt non-addressable RGB header, and we can't mix and match between these headers. If you do, you can damage your hardware, so it's really important you plug it in to the right header. So I'm going to line our cable up the right way round with the pins and just push it into place. Okay, next cable to plug in is the power cable for the 3 fans on the front of the case that Cooler Master very conveniently combined into a triple fan splitter cable. Now the fans on the case are 3-pin connectors, and we've got a 3-pin connector here. Importantly, our motherboard, all the fan headers have 4 pins on them. That's not a problem to us because there's little notches on the cable, so it's only going to plug into the right 3 pins on the 4-pin header. So it's just a matter of lining the notches up and pushing into place. Now importantly, because the included case fans only have 3-pin connectors on them, we're going to have to run them in DC mode. If we try to run them in PWM mode, they'll run at 100% of the speed all the time. I'll show you how to do this later on in the BIOS, but what we need to remember for now is that system fan header number 1 is where we have plugged our case fans into. We're going to occupy the other case fan headers with our Corsair fans. So it's important system fan 1 we're going to run in DC mode. Our Corsair fans have 4-pin connectors on them, so we're going to be able to run them in PWM mode. Okay, next lot of cables to plug in are these tricky front panel connectors. I say they're tricky because they all need to go into this header here, into certain pins. Now it's really important you look at the diagram and the motherboard manual to work out which of these go in which place. Okay, so starting in the top row, as I'm looking at the header on its side, top row from left to right, we have power LED positive and power LED negative. Okay, so power LED positive and then power LED negative. Next to that, we've got power switch positive and power switch negative. If we look at the power switch cable, there's no positive or negative marked on it. On the back of the cable, there is a little arrow marking the positive pin, so we're going to line that up with the positive pin on the header. For the power switch and reset switch, it doesn't really matter which way you put it in, but I do like to do things correctly and plug the positive pin into the positive header. Okay, so power switch positive and power switch negative. Okay, on to the next row at the bottom. So we have got hard drive LED positive and then negative. And then we have got the reset switch, which is negative and then positive in the next 2 pins along. Okay, next cable for us to plug in is this USB 3.0 cable coming from the USB ports on the front I/O, and we're going to plug it into this header here. Now this motherboard has 2 of these headers. There's one here, but also one down the bottom of the motherboard. The one down the bottom of the motherboard is quite close to a cutout we're going to use for our graphics card cables, and our graphics card is going to take 3 power cables, so I want to save that cutout for that particular cable, and that's the reason I'm going for this one here. Now, a word of caution when plugging this in. This is one of the headers you're most likely to damage the pins on in your motherboard, and if you do damage the pins, your front I/O ports aren't going to work, and I have done this in the past. There's a little notch on the cable and a little notch on the header, so it's important we line things up the right way, and if there's any resistance, we're not going to apply pressure and push it in. We're going to stop and line things up again because we don't want to damage these pins on the motherboard. So making sure things are lined up the right way, and then just a little bit of gentle pressure and it's locked and clicked into place. And then I'm just going to bring the excess cable out the back of the case. So that's all our case cables plugged in. The next thing I like to do is to plug in our power supply cables, because particularly the additional power supply for the CPU up the top left hand side of the motherboard is really difficult to plug in. Once you either put fans or a radiator at the top, and we're going to be putting our AIO at the top, and once it's on, it's going to be almost impossible to plug these cables in. So we'll go ahead and get our power supply installed next. This is our power supply, and this is what you call a fully modular power supply, because none of the cables are plugged in. And the big advantage of this is you only need to plug the cables in that you're going to use. Any that you're not going to use, you can leave out, and that way you're going to have an easier time managing the cables in your case. Downside to this is it tends to be a little bit more expensive than a non-modular, or a semi-modular power supply. Semi-modular means most of the essential cables are plugged in and the optional cables aren't. So the first thing for us to do is to go ahead and plug in the cables that we're going to use. So I'm just going to turn this up the right way so you can read the text. So our 24-pin cable has two different connectors. So we'll go ahead and plug it into here. Next to that, we have got 8-pin connectors on the power supply, and this is where we're going to plug the PCIe cables going to our graphics card, or the 8-pin cables going to our additional power for the CPU. Now I'm going to start off with the CPU. One end of the cable has CPU on it, the other end of the cable doesn't have any markings, so we're going to leave the CPU end to plug into our motherboard and plug the other end of the cable into here. Our motherboard is going to require 2 of these cables, and these slots continue on the bottom row, so I'm going to go ahead and plug the second cable into the bottom row, making sure to leave the end that says CPU free, so it's the end that's going to go into the motherboard. Next we need to go ahead and plug in the PCIe cable that is going to power our graphics card. So one cable actually has two 6+2-pin connectors on it, so this is going to power 2 8-pin connectors or an 8-pin connector on a 6-pin connector. Now for higher powered graphics cards, it is recommended that you don't use the one cable for 2 connectors on your graphics card. And as we've got an RTX 3080, I'm going to use 3 separate cables for the graphics card. So I'm going to go ahead and plug the 3 cables, continuing on in the bottom row. The next cable to plug in is a SATA power cable. So our SATA SSD is going to need power, it's going to get it from this. Any of the controllers that we're going to use, both with our AIO and with our case fans, are going to need SATA power. This one cable has 4 SATA power connectors, which is probably the number we're going to need. But to future-proof it a little bit, because it can be a bit more difficult to plug these in once it's installed in the case, I'm going to plug 2 SATA cables in. So that I want to add any additional SSDs in the future to the build, or I've miscalculated the number of SATA ports I'm going to need, it's not going to be that big of an issue. So we've actually got 5 SATA ports left on the power supply, so I'm going to plug 2 of them in just to the top row. So if you don't want to use the cable extensions, the power supply is now ready to go. I think the cable extensions will look better, so I'm going to go ahead and plug these into the end of the power supply. So if I take our 24-pin cable, there'll be a little notch on the cable and a little notch on the extension cable. So I'm going to go ahead and plug that in. Next, I'm going to go ahead and plug in the extension cables for our graphics card. Now it is important to mention this graphics card is going to take 3 of these cable extensions. The cable extension kits that come with cable mod only include 2 of the cables, so you are going to have to pick up a separate cable if you buy the kit. Now I do also have 2 black and white cable extensions for the additional power to the CPU cables, of which we've got 2. The thing is, we're not going to be able to see these cables once they're plugged in. The AIO is going to go at the top and completely block them. So it doesn't make any sense to use cable extensions for there, because it's going to make managing the cables at the back of the case that bit more difficult. And actually looking at this case, there doesn't look to be a lot of room at the back for managing cables. So I'm going to leave these 2 out. Okay, we're now ready to go ahead and put our power supply into the case. Importantly, our power supply has an intake fan where it's going to get cool air from. So we're going to want to install it with this intake fan facing down the way. Remember earlier on we pointed out the little dust filter at the bottom of the case. This is where our power supply is going to get fresh air. If we install the power supply placing up the way, it's going to have a solid panel up above it and it's going to struggle to get air and may well overheat. Okay, so we'll go ahead and slide the power supply in and then work it all the way to the back. And you can see now why I removed the hard drive cage. We're going to have a lot of cables down at the bottom of the case. And then we go ahead and secure the power supply into place using the screws from the accessory bag. Next we can go ahead and plug the power cables in. So I'm going to bring the ones for the additional power for the CPU in through this cutout at the top left hand side of the case. Now the sockets will have a notch on it and the cables have a notch, so it's important we line them up the right way. And then we can go ahead and plug them in. And again, there's a notch on the header and a notch on the cable, so we just need to line things up and then push. Now this cable does have little cable combs on it, which we can use to tidy up the cable and then pull the excess out the back of the case. Next thing for us to install is our SATA SSD. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over. And as we've mentioned, we're going to secure these little pegs in instead of screws. Okay, so just before we go ahead and mount the drive into the case, I want to point out the connectors that we've got. So we've got two gold L-shaped connectors, and SATA drives will have these. This particular drive has an extra port for the RGB. The longer L-shaped connector is for SATA power, so one of the power cables coming from our power supply is going to plug into here and power the drive. The shorter L-shaped connector is for SATA data, and we're going to get a SATA data cable in our motherboard box, and it's going to connect into the motherboard, allowing data transfer between the drive and the motherboard. So this is a SATA data cable. I'm going to go ahead and plug it in now. So all we need to do is line the L's up on the drive and push. This particular SATA cable has a little lock on it, so if before we can pull it out, we'll have to press the silver connector in, and that will then let us pull the drive out. But I'll go ahead and connect that up again. The additional port on the drive is for our RGB. We get a cable for it in the drive box. We'll go ahead and plug it in. So on the other end of the drive, we have a 3-pin 5-volt addressable ARGB connector, just the same as we have already plugged into our motherboard. Our motherboard has two of these, so I'm going to go ahead and plug this into the other header on our motherboard whenever we install the drive. So as we've mentioned, there's space to mount two drives, one here and one here. Now the cables for our graphics card are going to come out here and over here, so if we were to put a drive here, we wouldn't see very much of it. So I'm going to mount our drive over to the left hand side of the case. To allow us to do this, we just need to push these little rubber grommets through the holes on the case. I'm then going to feed the cables coming from the drive into the back of the case. And then I'm going to bring one of the SATA power cables coming from our power supply through the cutout and plug it into the drive. Again, it's just a matter of lining the two L's up and pushing, and the cable clips into place. Then all we need to do is line the little stand-ups up with the rubber grommets, and once we're happy things are in place, just push the drive down. Next, we just need to plug the other end of the SATA data cable into our motherboard. So I'm going to bring it through this cutout here. We've got 4 SATA sockets here, so it doesn't matter which of them we plug into. I'm just going to line the L's up. Actually, the bottom sockets are going to fit in better, and then push it into place. Okay, last thing for us to do to install our SATA drive is to plug the other end of the addressable ARGB cable coming from the drive into our motherboard, and our second ARGB header on the motherboard is down the bottom right hand side. So I'm just going to make sure things are lined up the right way and then push into place, and then we'll tuck the S6 cable into the back. So this cable has an additional connector on it, so all I'm going to do is use one of the cable ties from our accessory bag to tie this cable to the main bit of the cable, so it's going to hopefully make things a little bit tidier. And then when the graphics card cables are installed, hopefully we won't see this at all. And then we'll pull the excess cable out the back. Yeah, and that definitely looks a bit tidier. So this is our AIO. The first job for us to do is to put the brackets onto the pump head. So we turn the pump head over. We're going to put one little bracket here, the screws through and go ahead and secure it into place. And then same again on the other side. Next thing for us to do is to go ahead and put the fans on the radiator. Now this AIO does come with 3 fans. It's a 360mm radiator. The problem with the fans is they don't have any RGB on them. And I think the build's going to look better if I use some fans that have RGB on them. So I'm going to use the Corsair LL120 fans on the radiator. And I am sacrificing performance for looks, because certainly this fan will give us better cooling. It's optimized for static pressure, whereas this fan is more optimized for airflow. But I think this fan is going to look better in this particular build. So for putting the fans on the radiator, the first thing is we have to decide on the orientation. Our radiator is going to be at the top of the case. It's going to be an exhaust at the top of the case, so we want the front of the fans facing into the case. So this way round is right. This is the front of the fan, this is the back of the fan. The next thing we need to decide is we want the wires facing the back of the case. I do want the tubes over to the right hand side of the case, because I think that's going to look better. So we're going to need to install our fans on the radiator this way around, so that the wires are going to be facing over to the back. So in the AIO box, we're going to get some long radiator screws. So I'm just going to pass them through the fans and into the radiator. And I'm just going to tighten them up gently first of all. Okay, so now I want to talk you through how I'm going to connect everything up. It's easier probably to do this on the flat table than once we put things into the case. Coming from our pump head, we've got 2 different connectors. The first is a 3-pin fan connector, which is going to go into the pump header on our motherboard. This is going to power the pump, and our motherboard is then going to be able to control the speed of the pump. Importantly, as this is a 3-pin connector rather than a 4-pin connector, we're going to have to run the pump in DC mode rather than PWM mode. So again, just something we need to remember when we go into the motherboard, because if it's set up to PWM mode, the pump is going to run at 100% all of the time. The second cable we've got coming from our pump head is for the pump RGB. And with this, we've got 2 options. Including our AIO, we have a little adapter. So all we would need to do is plug the adapter in. And then it has an addressable ARGB header on the end, similar to the 2 that we've already plugged into our motherboard. Now we have occupied both of the addressable ARGB headers on our motherboard, so we're going to struggle to plug this additional cable in without buying an additional hub or splitter cable. Now the AIO does give us an alternative option. Rather than plugging this cable in, we can go ahead and plug in this little controller. All we would then need to do is plug the other end into our SATA power supply to power the controller, and then we'll be able to control the lights on the pump head using these buttons. And that's the option I'm going to go for. I'm just planning on setting the pump head to white, and I know from previous experience this controller offers that as an option. So this brings us on to the fans, and I have made a separate guide to installing the LL120 fans, although I'm probably going to cover everything here as well. So coming from each of the fans, we've got 2 different connectors. We've got a standard 4-pin fan connector, which is going to power our fan and allow our motherboard to control the speed of it. Now, because these are 4-pin connectors, it's going to work in PWM mode. The other connector coming from the fan is for RGB, and Corsair use proprietary RGB connectors, so I'm going to talk you through how we connect it up after we've dealt with the power. So coming from the fans, there's going to be 3 fan power cables, but our motherboard only has 1 CPU fan header. So fortunately with the AIO, you get a 3-to-1 fan splitter cable. So all we need to do is plug each of the power cables coming from the fans into the splitter cable. So I'll go ahead and do that now. Okay, so that's all of our fans. now controlled by this single 4-pin connector, which we're going to plug into the CPU fan header on our motherboard. So as we've mentioned, Corsair use their own proprietary connectors. If you buy the triple fan pack, you will get one of these RGB hubs and also the Lightning Node Pro, which you're going to need to connect up to your motherboard. If you buy the single fan pack, you won't get this, so be careful if you're buying fans. You're going to want to get the triple pack because you're going to need this RGB hub and possibly the Lightning Node Pro, depending on the connections your motherboard offers. So the first thing for us to do is to go ahead and plug in the fans into ports number 1, 2 and 3. It's really important with these Corsair fan hubs that you occupy the fans in order. If you leave a gap, it's going to break the chain and any fans plugged in after the gap won't work. So we're going to plug into fan number 1, 2 and 3. And it's important you have the fans in order. If you're going to want effects moving from one fan to the other, it would make sense to have the fans 1, 2 and 3, so the effect moved along them in order. Now the other cable coming from the hub is a SATA power connector. It's going to power the RGB hub, so we're going to need to plug this into our power supply. Next we need to go ahead and plug the other end of the cable, which comes with the triple fan pack, into this end of the RGB hub. Our motherboard's a pretty high-end motherboard and it actually has a Corsair fan connector. So all we actually need to do to control the RGB is plug this into the Corsair fan header on our motherboard. Not all motherboards have the fan header, so I will show you what you need to do if your motherboard doesn't have one. Also included in the triple fan kit, you get a Lightning Node Pro. The Lightning Node Pro can control a maximum of 2 fan hubs. There's 2 channels and each of them able to take 6 fans, so you can power 12 fans in total using the Lightning Node Pro. So all we need to do, rather than plugging into the Corsair fan connector in our motherboard, we can plug into channel 1 of the Lightning Node Pro. The Lightning Node Pro is also going to take a SATA connector, so that would need plugged into our power supply. We're then going to need to connect the Lightning Node Pro to our motherboard using USB. So we would go ahead and plug the USB cable into the Lightning Node Pro. And then the other end of this USB cable into one of the USB 2.0 ports down the bottom of our motherboard. We would then use the Corsair iQ software to control the fans. But like I've mentioned, because our motherboard has a Corsair connector, I'm going to remove the Lightning Node Pro and just plug this end into the motherboard, and we're going to use our motherboard software to control all the RGB in our build. Again, you're probably going to get more effects with the Corsair iQ software, but for me, I'm just going to set the fans to white and I'm going to be happy enough using the motherboard software. Okay, so we're now ready to get the AIO into the case. Okay, first stage is to plug all the cables coming from the fans through the back of the case. I have unplugged the fan hub to allow me to get them through the back of the case, but once they're through, I'll go ahead and plug this back in again. Next, we can go ahead and line the radiator up with the top of the case, just pulling the excess cables through as we go. It's going to require a little tilt to get it fitted in. And then I'm just going to need to pull the case cables at the front over to the side and out of the way. Next, we just need to secure the radiator to the top of the case using the screws that come with the AIO. Next thing for us to do is to apply some thermal paste to the CPU. So I like to apply a pea-sized amount to the middle of the CPU. Okay, that should do. Next we can go ahead and put the pump head onto the little brackets we applied earlier. It is important to mention, if you're using the AIO for the first time over the cold plate, you're going to have some plastic protection which should be removed. I've used this before, so it doesn't have any on it. So all we want to do is line this up with the little standoffs we put in earlier on to the motherboard. And once we have it in place, we're just going to apply a little bit of pressure to the top of it, keeping it in the same area. We're then just going to secure it in place. You get these in the AIO box, and I'm only trying to get these on loosely first of all, and then we'll tighten them up once we've got each corner on. What I'm going to do is tighten each a few turns, is going from corner to corner. So it's at this stage I've realised I should really have plugged in the cables to the top of the motherboard before installing the radiator. I did mention it earlier in the video, but I need to plug in the triple fan splitter cable coming from our fans at the top of the radiator into the CPU fan heater. We need to plug the cable coming from the pump into the pump header on the top of the motherboard, and we need to plug in our Corsair connector, which is going to go up the top. I think we can probably get the Corsair one in without any problem, but the two pump and CPU fan header we're going to struggle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen the radiator, bring it down, plug the cables in, and then put the radiator back on. So important lesson, plug these cables in first before putting the radiator on. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and plug the triple splitter cable coming from our 3 fans in the radiator into the CPU fan header, and it is the header at the top here at the front, furthest over to the left hand side. So just lining things up, and then that's that plugged in. So I'm going to take the 2 cables coming from the pump. I'm going to take the pump power supply connector and plug it into the next header along. Again, it's a 3-pin connector, but because of the little notches on the header and on the cable, it can only go into the right 3 pins. Okay, so that's that one plugged in, and then I'm going to feed the RGB cable out the back with the other wires. Last cable to bring through is the cable coming from our Corsair fan hub, and it's going to go to this header in the top right hand side of the motherboard. Okay, so that's that one plugged in. Now we can go ahead and put the radiator back on at the top. Okay, so I've replugged in the fan hub and the fan controller for the AIO pump. The only additional thing to do is to power both of them by connecting them up to the SATA power connector. So we'll go ahead and do that. Just line the L's up, and then the one on the other. Okay, so that's our AIO installed. Next we can go and add in our last case fan, and I'm just going to have to feed these cables up and out the back. And likewise, this would have been another useful cable to have had plugged in before I went ahead and installed the AIO, although I've managed to feed the cables out the back without too much trouble. Okay, this fan is just secured with 4 screws which come with the fan itself. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the fan cable down and through this cutout, and then I'm going to plug it into one of the fan headers up at the top of the motherboard over on the right hand side. Okay, so that's the fan powered. The only additional step to install the case fan is to plug the RGB cable in. So we've got our RGB controller here, and I'm going to plug this fan into slot number 4 on the RGB hub, and that's our case fan installed. Next thing for us to do is to install our graphics card, and our graphics card is going to go in this top PCIe slot. In general, you want to use the top slot on your motherboard to get the fastest speeds. So we're going to need to remove the second and third bracket cover over here. To prepare the motherboard to receive the GPU, we just need to open the clip here. Okay, so we just need to line the graphics card up with the slot. Once we're happy things are lined up, it's just a little bit of firm pressure and it will lock and clip into place. And then we just need to secure the graphics card using the 2 screws that we removed earlier on. Next, we just need to feed the graphics card power supply cables through the cutout at the bottom of the case. And then we can go ahead and plug these into the graphics card. Then we can go ahead and tidy up the 3 cables using the cable combs. So this brings me on to my least favourite job of any build. We have to tidy this mess of cables up. so we can get our back panel on, and there's not a lot of room in the back. Importantly, we've got some cable tie points and included cable ties, which is going to make things a little bit easier. And there's a lot of space down the bottom, particularly for the power supply cables. So we'll go ahead and get these cables managed. Okay, so we can go ahead and see if we can get the back panel on. And then we can go ahead and secure it with the thumb screws at the back. Okay, so that's the PC built. I think it looks absolutely great, but doesn't run. So we're going to need to go ahead and flip the power switch and see what happens. Importantly, I have loaded a Windows 10 bootable USB drive into the back of the PC. If you don't know how to make one of those, I've made a video on it and I'll put a link to that in the description. Okay, here it goes. So that's a good sign. We've got lights, we've got fans spinning, and we just need to look at the screen and see what happens. What we're looking for is the PC to find the Windows 10 bootable USB drive and boot off that, because obviously our SSDs don't have any operating system on them. So it's just we need to wait patiently and watch the screen. Okay, so let's have a look at the screen. We can see it's found our processor and our RAM and our storage devices. So it's asking us to press F1 to run setup or F2 to load volumes. So we'll go ahead and press F2. So hopefully now it's going to go ahead and find the Windows drive, which it has done. And then we'll just wait and hopefully it'll boot off the drive. Okay, so that's us through to the Windows installer screen. I'm going to show you how to install Windows 10, but to make it easier, I'm going to switch over to the screen mode. Now, importantly with this build, I was able to go straight to installing Windows 10. And the reason for that is I've used this motherboard before, and I have a fairly recent version of the BIOS, which allows it to work with Zen 3 CPUs. If you're buying this motherboard new and out of the box, it will need a BIOS update before it's likely to work with Zen 3 CPUs. I have made a video on how to flash the BIOS. You'll put a link to that in the description as well. In that video, I did show it at the start with the motherboard on the table and no CPU or RAM or anything else plugged into it, just the power supply. You can of course do the same process at the end where everything is installed. So as we go along, I'm going to select certain options. If you have obviously different options, select the options that apply to you. So I'm from the United Kingdom, I'm going to click Next. I'm going to click Install Now. If you've got a Windows 10 product key, go ahead and enter it in the box. If you don't have one, click I don't have a product key. Then you need to select which version of Windows you're going to get a product key for in the future. I'll select Windows 10 Pro and click Next. We need to accept the license terms and click Next. And then we're going to go for a custom install. Okay, so looking at the drives we have available, we've got drive 0, drive 1 and drive 2. And we have actually 4 drives installed. These are all 1 terabyte drives that are showing up. So they are our M.2 SSD drives. So the one that isn't showing up is our SATA drive. Just going to have a quick look at it. And what I can see is the SATA power cable has become dislodged from the drive. Obviously when I was tidying up the cables, I've pushed them into the bottom and the cable has come loose. So I'll fix that in a minute once we've got Windows installed. But in general, what I have found is your SATA drives tend to come up first. Then what will happen is the M.2 SSDs will come up. And I find that the first M.2 SSD tends to be the one in the first slot. So the chances are drive 0 is our Gen 4 M.2 SSD, which is where we want to install Windows 10 onto. So I'm going to go ahead and select drive 0 and click Next. Okay, I'm from the United Kingdom, so I'm going to select United Kingdom. And the keyboard layout is United Kingdom as well. I don't want to add a secondary keyboard, so I'm going to click Skip. I'm going to set this up for personal use. Click Next. If you've got a Microsoft account, you can go ahead and put it in here now. If you don't, you can create an online account or use an offline account. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'll show you how it works with an offline account. I'm going to select limited experience and type my name in. It's going to ask me to create a password. I'm then going to have to create security questions. And then again, I'm going to select don't use online speech recognition, yes to location, yes to find my device, only the required diagnostic data, no, 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 not now. Okay, so that's Windows 10 installed, but before we go on ahead and install any drivers, we want to update Windows to the latest version. So we click on the Windows icon, go to Settings, Updates and Security, and check for updates. We're going to let Windows fully up to date before we go ahead and install any drivers. It's probably going to want to restart itself a number of times during these updates, but we'll let it do that, and only when there's no further updates available will we move on to installing the drivers. Next thing for us to do is to get all our SSDs to show up, because despite the fact that we've got 4 SSDs in this build, the chances are only one of them will be showing up. So we go down and click here and click on this PC. You can see we've only got one drive, which is local disk C. So to get the rest of our drives to show up, we need to go down to the bottom and type in disk management. And then click on the create and format hard disk partitions. So what we can see, disk 0, which is our SATA drive, which has now appeared. We've also got disk 2 and disk 3, which are showing up as unallocated spaces. Okay, so we'll start off with the Samsung 970 EVO drive. So we'll right click on it, click new simple volume, next, next. It's going to assign the letter D. I'm happy with that. If I'm not, I change it in the pull down menu. Click next, and we'll call it okay, same thing for disk 3, new simple volume, next, next, it's assigned the letter E, next. And click next. Same thing for disk 0, right click, new simple volume, next, next, next. And we're going to call this next, finish. Okay, so we can go ahead and close this down, and if we go back to this PC, we can now see that we've got all 4 of our SSDs showing up. The only problem, I've labeled this one wrong. I can click on rename and change the D to an S. Okay, there we go. Next thing for us to do is to go ahead and get some drivers. I'm going to install these from a variety of different sources. Don't worry about trying to note down the links as you go along. I'm going to put all the links in the description. Okay, so we're over on our motherboards page over on MSI's website. It starts off in the BIOS page. If you need to update your BIOS, this is where you're going to get your BIOS from. I've got this version here, which is the last version, which is in the beta, already installed. And this was the reason my PC worked. I had a version of the BIOS which was compatible with the CPU. If you're buying this motherboard from new and the BIOS version hasn't been updated, you may well have one of the older versions of the BIOS which doesn't support the new Zen 3 CPUs, and that's why your computer won't boot. So you need to go and have a look at my video and flash the BIOS. So let's head over to the drivers and see what drivers we need to install. So we're going to select our operating system, and then I'm just going to expand all these to see what's on offer. Okay, so working our way through, we're not going to use RAID, so we don't need the drivers. The chipset drivers we do want, but I'm going to get them from AMD's website because they tend to be more up to date. Onboard VGA drivers, we've got a dedicated NVIDIA graphics card. We're not going to use a CPU with integrated graphics, so we don't need this. We're going to install the LAN drivers, so I'll go ahead and download these. Click on Open File. Click on the Intel Bluetooth. Next. I agree. Next. Just go for typical install. Install. Yes. And click Finish. Okay, next we'll go ahead and get the Intel Wi-Fi driver. Click Open File. Click on the installer and click on the wireless setup. Click Extract All, Extract. And click on Wireless Setup. Click Next. I agree. Install. Yes. Click Finish. We'll go ahead and download the Ethernet drivers. Click Open File. Click the Setup. Yes. Next. Install. Click Finish. And then the last driver we're going to get from MSI is the onboard audio driver. So we'll go ahead and click Download. Click Open File. Click the Setup. Yes. Next. And we'll go ahead and restart the computer. Okay, next we're over on AMD's page. We're going to click on chipsets. We've got an AM4 socket and an X570 motherboard and click Submit. We're going to expand here and then go ahead and download the chipset drivers. Okay, we can go ahead and click on Open File. Click Yes. Click Install. And then click Restart. Okay, we have an NVIDIA graphics card. We need to get our drivers from NVIDIA. We can either install the drivers themselves or download the GeForce Experience. I'm going to show you how to download the GeForce Experience. So click Download Now. We can go ahead and click Open File. Yes. Click Agree and Install. Okay, if you've got a NVIDIA account, you need to log in. If you don't, you need to create one. Okay, so we can skip the tour. So what we want to do is click on the driver tab. What we can see is it's found a Game Ready driver for us, so we can go ahead and click Download. Okay, we can go ahead and click Express Installation, click Yes. And it's normal for the screen to flicker as the drivers have been installed. Okay, so that's that installed. Okay, we're back over on our motherboards page in MSI's website. We've installed all the drivers we need to install, but to control our RGB software, we're going to need to download a utility from the utilities page, and it's MSI Dragon Center that we're going to need. We need to install Dragon Center to get the Mystic Light LED control. It doesn't come separately anymore, and the only way to get it is through Dragon Center. Others have reported some problems with Dragon Center affecting their performance of their PC adversely. If you want to use the RGB control software, there's no way around it. The only alternative would be to use the controller that came with the case and to use controllers to control all your RGB. I'm going to show you how to install it in case this is the way you want to go. I've never had any problems myself with it. Okay, we can go ahead and click on Open File. Click on the Dragon Center and click Extract All. Extract. Then click on the Dragon Center again. Click Yes. Okay, install. Find the shortcut, right click, More, and we're going to run as administrator. Click Yes. Just scan down to the bottom, click Next. We're going to scan down to the bottom again, click I have read, and click OK. Okay, so we can go ahead and click Skip. And then it's the Mystic Light that we want to open. So at the moment, all our RGB is set to rainbow. Everything on the motherboard is selected. If we want to control individual components, we can pick them from here. I'm going to leave everything selected as all. I'm going to go over to here and click on a steady color. And then I want to drag this all the way up to the top to give myself white, and then click apply. And what we can now see is everything is turned to white. So the fans at the front of the case, our SSD and our Corsair fans. Like I say, if you want to change the individual components, we could go into here and change each of them. Okay, so we're over on our graphics cards page on Asus's website, and we want to scan down, and what we're looking for is the Armoury Crate. Be careful, the first version is the uninstall tool. It's the actual Armoury Crate software that we're looking for. So click download, click open file, and we'll double click on the installer. Click yes, click start. So we can go ahead and click on launch. We can click on I agree and accept. So we can see our graphics card is showing up. So we can go to the effects. What we're going to want to set it to is static to match the rest of our RGB. And then if we click on the color tab, that should give us white, and then click OK. So you can see now everything is set to white. The only little annoying thing is the red writing down the bottom of the motherboard. I think it distracts from the look of the build, but we're going to turn it off now when we head over into the BIOS. So there's a few things we need to do in the BIOS. One of the things we want to disable the red LED lighting. We want to get our memory running at the correct speed, and we want to have a look at the fan curves to check things are running the way we want them to. So we'll head over into the BIOS now. Okay, to enter the BIOS, what we're going to need to do is restart our computer. So we go and click on the power options and click restart. While the computer is restarting, we're going to want to press the delete key, and that's going to take us into the BIOS. So I normally wait till the PC goes black and then start hitting the delete key. So we'll go ahead and start pressing it. And that's us into the BIOS. So you can see I have a fairly recent updated version of the BIOS from the 14th of November. There is one version that's a beta version which is more up to date than this. I could go ahead and update it, but I don't really see the need to because everything's running as it should. If you want to know how to update the BIOS, I've done it in a few of my previous build guides, so go and have a look at those, and it should be timestamped in the video. Okay, so first thing for us to do is to get our memory running at the correct speed. So we go ahead and click on our memory. What we can see, our memory is currently running at 2400 megahertz. We can see that we've got two XMP profiles in it to it we can enable here. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it on. We've enabled profile 1. It doesn't matter which of the two because they're both the same. Next thing to do is to go ahead and turn off the indicator LED control. So I'll go ahead and do that now. And that should get rid of the red light for us on the motherboard. Next thing is we click on the fan info and click on the settings. We can check the fans are running as they should. So having a look, we've got our CPU fan header, which is the three fans on the AIO. They're taking their temperature off the CPU, they're running in PWM mode, they're 4-pin connectors, and they're using smart fan mode. So that's the way I would normally set them up. Looking at our pump is currently running in PWM mode. It's only got 3 pins, so it needs to run in DC mode. I don't normally run the smart fan mode on the pump, I normally just run it at 100%, so I'm going to leave it as it is, and it's taking its temperature off the CPU. Okay, so system fan 1 is where we have the 3 case fans at the front of the case. Now they've only got a 3-pin connector, so they're running in DC mode. If we had selected PWM mode, if you look and see what happens, the speed of the fans will ramp up and they've become quite noisy. So you can hear them in the background, they're running up at 100%. So DC mode was the right setting. I just wanted to turn it this way because some of you may well have problems and wonder why. And I do normally run the smart fan mode, which is going to give us a little curve over here where it's going to adjust the speed of the fans depending on the CPU temperature because we have selected the CPU temperature. We could select the other temperature sources and it would then adjust depending on these. So we turn smart fan mode on, it's going to follow this curve. Now the only other place we've got a fan plugged in is over at System Fan 4. Now System Fan 4 is our Corsair fan at the back of the case. It's got 4-pin connector on it, so we can run it in PWM mode and also enable smart fan mode. And again, it's taking its temperature off the CPU, which is fine. Okay, so to save our settings, all we need to do is press the X icon, press it again, and click yes. And that's the computer is going to boot back into Windows, and what we can see is the red lighting at the bottom of the motherboard has now disappeared. Next, we're going to want to check our RAM is running at the correct speed, so we right click on the Start menu and click on Task Manager. We can click More Details, click on the Performance tab, and then click on the Memory. So we can see our RAM is now running at the full 3200 MHz. Okay, so that's the PC build complete. I think it looks great and it's also running really well. Hopefully you find this video useful. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and click that subscribe button. Channel's growing really well, but your subscription can make a real difference. Likewise, if you're new to the channel, I've got plenty of other PC builds and related content on the channel. So if you've liked this video, chances are you like my other PC build videos. So please go ahead and check those out. Okay, so that's everything for now. I'm going to run some benchmarks and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.
I